Good evening. First, we'd like to express our great appreciation to Pearson for sponsoring this event. This is an important event, a legacy of a great person, and we are really appreciative that they choose to sponsor this and make it possible for us to share in the exchange of ideas. It's one of the underlying premises of NCA, and I'm very happy to have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight. Interrogate this: how does one evaluate the worthiness of a scholar to fulfill the promise of the Carroll C. Arnold Lecture? I recommend you to joshuagunn.net/vita. So let's first ask, do numbers tell the story? Well, it's a 39-page Vita, so we're done here. There's also two books, a book on modern occult rhetoric and a textbook on speechcraft. And then, not finally, but significantly, 45 peer-reviewed journal articles, most of them, not all of them, but most of them in our flagship quarterly journal of speech. What about training? We look to a person's training to identify their value. After graduating from George Washington University with a BA and a double major in philosophy and communication, Joshua received his master's degree and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. And as to the quality of his training, I simply indicate his committee for his PhD included Robert Brown, Carlin Kors Campbell, Ed Schiappa, Bob Scott, and Kurt Wilson. Enough said on the training. What about collaborators? A mark of a significant scholar is the people that they collaborate with, as well as their collaborative willingness. So Joshua has written with John Sloop. That looks like Sean Treat, Jenny Ride, John Lucades, Mirko Hall, Thomas Frentz, and Dana Cloud, among a number of others. How about provocative topics? So, addressing issues of genre and ideology, the occult, and the notion of voice, Joshua has constantly come back to Lacanian psychology and the subject-object interplay, and has a number of provocative issues that he has addressed. The psychodynamics of demagoguery, shit text, a new coprophilic style. Remember, this is an R-rated program, so I'll just draw that attention. That particular article was one of the articles that first drew my attention to Joshua Gunn as a rhetorical critic. Zombie trouble and ideology, haunting of speech, the fantasy and talking to the dead, canned laughter, Fight Club as cinematic psychosis, Da Vinci Code as alchemical rhetoric, and the Passion of the Christ as mainstream pornography. But the numbers, the timing, the training, the collaboration, and the provocative topics are not enough. So I offer you, by aphorism, we will examine his ideas. First, the aphorism of the emperor's clothing. I'm sure you're all familiar with that particular story. From Talking to the Dead, an article about Jonathan Edwards the psychic. Talking to the dead, he writes, is simply a more conspicuous and exaggerated elaboration of the underlying fantasy that is central to the ways we think about rhetoric, the mediation or reconciliation of self and other across a terrible, yawning gap. Insofar as the rhetorical agent has been dead for a very long time, rhetorical scholars should recognize, beyond a narrow historicism, that we are psychics, that we perform cold readings, that talking to the dead is what we do. Another example of the emperor's clothing is the concept of social networking and psychosis, one of his recent articles. Describing public discourse as exhibiting psychical structures homologous to those of individuals helps us to explain the increasing regularity of psychotic rhetoric as an emerging genre of discourse vying for hegemony. The constant and relentless parade of immediacy, so characteristic of social networking, seems to be producing the kind of discourse of someone who is constantly speaking certitudes in the moment, like a switchboard for the communication pulsating in a charged and mediated sea of speakers and screens. The next aphorism: fiddling while Rome burns. On the topic of George Bush and the rhetoric surrounding the 9/11 event, one very important reason why exorcism is a useful description of Bush's recent rhetoric is because it helps us to see better the enthymematic function of evil and how the use of evil in demon-making sets a civil pedagogy, a subtle form of discipline, into motion. Describing the racial other as evil is a civic lesson in the intolerance of righteousness. More recently, Josh has written about political perversion. In this essay, I have argued that Trump's rhetoric is perverse because of a litany of disavowals, first at the level of the statement, occultatio, second at the level of style, and third at the level of genre. Such a remarkable consistency among multiple rhetorical context indexes a perverse psychical structure or a disposition or set of strategies for relating to others characterized by the absence of doubt and the simultaneous acknowledgement and denial of consensus order. Third and final aphorism: the prophet crying in the wilderness. In The Haunting of Speech, Josh writes, "I lament the disappearance of speech from many of our departmental nameplates, and I make an intentionally polemical call for its return in the examination and criticism of contemporary cultural and theatrical performance. First, the haunting of speech refers to the ghosting or spectralization of the human voice that results from the forgetting catalyzed by the dominance of visuality. Second, the haunting of speech refers to haunting by the human voice or the ways in which speech troubles us as a disembodied object, which is the consequence of technologies of recording and telepresence. And finally, fantasy and the imaginary, a prophet crying in the wilderness. Symbolic convergence theory," he writes, "was the first to advance a more contingent understanding of rhetorical agency, suggesting fruitful directions for ideological criticism that unfortunately were derailed by misjudgments concerning the role of the unconscious in rhetorical invention. In addition to providing a corrective to recent disciplinary history, this essay urges a reconsideration of the role of imagination and the imaginary in invention as a theoretical project that may reconcile or at least manage the tension between criticism that relies on a traditional, self-directed rhetorical agent and that which assumes a decentered, post-humanist subject." Enough of aphorisms. My introduction has a storybook ending. Words of reflection from the culture verse. So for bravery and the courage to stand up, do you feel lucky, punk? For a stubborn streak that won't quit, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And finally, for the rhetoric of pleasure and the pleasure of rhetoric, I'll have what he's having. Ladies and gentlemen, an iconoclast, a radical, a person of interest. I introduce to you Dr. Joshua Gunn of the University of Texas at Austin.
All right. Everybody here okay? It's turned on. Well, thank you. Thanks to NCA for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Star. Pearson for sponsoring, as well as the individual sponsors or donors. And, of course, my colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin, who let me do a dress rehearsal and ensured that I wouldn't embarrass myself too much. I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude to two mentors in the field. The first, of course, is Carroll C. Arnold, in whose name I lecture today. Although I did not know Professor Arnold, I've been taught by many who did, and all of them speak about his intellectual generosity and charity. And you're going to have a question at the end of this talk, and my answer is going to be the virtue of charity. I also am grateful for the mentoring of my advisor, Robert Scott, who passed away this summer. He was a brilliant and kind soul, and in the spirit of Arnold and our conference theme, R.L. was unquestionably one of the more playful luminaries of our field. One of his favorite mottos was an existential question, which I wear on a button on my lapel, and that question is, what if the hokey pokey really is what it's all about? I'd like to begin by reflecting on the exigency that triggered this year's conference theme, Communication at Play, which we have been told is intentionally ambiguous and fun. To help refresh your memory of this causal crisis, I have a short clip. That's right, friends. The exigency for our playful conference theme today is our somber 2016 conference in the city of sorrowful siblings. For many of us, the 2016 conference was funerary, both awake and a call from beyond by our interred sisters and ancestors of color who told us to get out, like to Canada, or to get woke. This darkly comical scene from Hal Ashby's 1971 cult film Harold and Maude captures our attempts to play the part of resilient marchers while pallbearing the political, motivating our comrades to push back the darkness despite a mournful mood that something, both a promise and a pretense, has died. I'm not so much referencing the unexpected results of the election as I am the palpably distressed personality of our Congress then and the belief that long-established norms of propriety have been perverted. Now, despite a melodramatic or secretly jubilant mood, the field marshaled on, trampling the brittle grasses of apathy and birding for flights of beer and humor, which is to say, we played. One of the most widely read scholars of play, second only, I suspect, to Jean Piaget, is British psychoanalyst Donald Woods Winnicott, who argued play is a form of creativity and essential for selfhood. Elaborating Winnicott's theory, Andre Green put things more starkly, quote, I think it is in the presence of horror that we understand the necessity of play in making reality bearable. In this respect, President-elect Muir rightly understood that play is reparative. Whether it is warranted, the widely expressed horror about our current political predicament prods a puckish riposte, from late-night television skits to web-based satire to a conference lecture. Now, in this spirit, I'm reminded of an anecdote about a lecture Winnicott gave last century. As he saddled up to speak, so the story goes, he produced a handgun from his briefcase and laid it upon the podium. After some minutes of audience discomfort, Winnicott presumably said that the revolver was for the person who dared to claim that his presentation was inappropriate. I thought I might repeat the gag, but then I boarded this bad idea with Plan B, a so-called headshot to advertise this talk. Needless to say, NCA chose not to use this shot, which now, as you can see, is presently more gigantic than any poster or advertisement. Some people said it was the best headshot they've ever seen. The best. They said it was. I'm just saying. I don't know, so we didn't use it. Still, this disease over this deliberately ambiguous headshot underscores a primary assumption of my remarks today. Like a funeral procession striding aside a marching band, play is not simply an ambiguous concept. It is fundamentally an ambivalent one. Culturally, the word play is romanticized in the fantasy of an innocent nonage, and with the possible exception of sport, we rarely think about cheating, or we rarely think about how some folks refuse to play nice. The hegemony of play's innocent connotations is well represented in the conference call, and especially in the follow-up imperative on CritNet that any proposed conference play spaces must reflect fun or whimsy, as opposed to, say, the fetish dungeons of so-called grown-ups and their 50 shades of play. I'm told on Grindr there was play, it's just not in the rooms here. Because of these demands for compulsory fun, I felt an obligation to address the dark side of play. Now, given the concept's ambivalence, I will argue that an attention to a public's moods of pedagoggical play, that is, what I call foul play or dirty play, broadly speaking, produces something like a partially developed Polaroid of the communicative structures that enable and constrain difficult conversations. To put this more plainly, today I will argue that contemporary modes of pathological play are symptomatic of a structural shift from neurotic to perverse norms of discourse. My focus here is not on the individual, but the aggregate or congeries of persons that constitute a community or a public, which is a characteristically sociological or materialist vantage that regards playing dirty as a cultural expression of a popular and festering pus. Now, in the broadest strokes, the context of my remarks today is a forthcoming book-length argument that U.S. political culture is becoming increasingly perverse. The concept of play is central to this argument because of the reality testing that play represents. My gambit is that an attention to darker cultural trends in play, from video gaming to politics, does tell us something about shifts and changes in the social body. To this end, I'll elaborate my argument about the cultural perversion of play in 3 parts. In the first part, I'll take some time to explain what I mean by neurosis and perversion, using a model cribbed from Jacques Lacan, a philosophically oriented French psychoanalyst. Doing so will help me better explain Winnicott's conception of play in trans-individual terms in the second part. In the third part, I'll illustrate how mediated spectacle represents an ascendant form of perverse play in our time, most conspicuously, of course, in our electoral politics. And finally, I'll bring the cultural logics of play to bear on the most significant public health problem of our time, which is, of course, one of the most significant, I should say, which is, of course, playing with guns. Now, because some of what I will discuss today is abstract, I think it's going to be helpful for us to begin with a few unrelated examples that, of course, I will argue are related, right? That's what we do. The first clip is a cultural critique clothed in comedy. Now, this skit from the incomparable Key and Peele references one of the celebrated scandals of our time, which is now a technologically facilitated mainstay in our news media, which, of course, is sexting. Speaking of sex, you're likely expecting my second example to come from the White House, which it does, but only by degrees, because the victim of foul play here is actually not a person. It's going to be a bad meme, or it's going to become an excellent example for a lecture on perversion. Here, Rudy Giuliani bumbles through an argument familiar to many of us, which is that truth is perspectival, at best, a cognitive coordination of Venn diagrams, especially in a legal system premised on an adversarial process. Although most of us understand what he meant, it was nevertheless taken up as an astonishing statement and a kind of motto for so-called fake news, political disinformation, and the truthful hyperbole from the present administration. Finally, of course, indecision about where to locate the place of truth in our contemporary moment overlaps with the ethical issue of responsibility. Without an anchor in truth or fact, to what or to whom are people responsible? Now, many may claim that it's common decency, or perhaps the all-seeing eye of deity. Even so, in our contemporary mediated social world, what matters the most is acting right now, in the present, achieving immediate notoriety through action. Such an attitude or approach is often adopted by those who claim the radical or the extreme, and it's the disposition of what we call a troll. For example, now, I've presented here 3 examples that may not seem related, at least intellectually, but they do reverberate with a kind of delicate discomfort, right? Sexting scandals, the unmooring of truth, and hate speech. I would submit that their relationship has to do with authority, and more pointedly, the perception in each case of the erosion or absence of an authority. In each example, the speaker assumes, consciously or not, that there is no ultimate oversight, that truth is unanchored, or that injurious speech is permissible. What is common to these examples is formal. In each case, we can imagine a speaker set into relationship to some object of meaning, which I'll designate here as discourse. So a politician is made to confront images he dispatched of his junk. A lawyer is set in relationship to something called truth, and a social media troll is called on to reckon with his vile tweets. And in each case, there is an assumption of the absence of some third thing, a kind of authorial overseer that might judge these behaviors as untruthful or immoral. In these examples, the third thing is initially perceived to be either absent or inconsequential. Authorities are faking it to make it, facts are fabrications of biased journalists, and there is no punishing government or God because humility is for losers. Following the work of the political philosopher Jody Dean and the Lacanian theorist Slavoj Žižek, the elision or erosion of this third thing is dubbed the decline of symbolic efficiency. A given community is symbolically efficient when everyone shares some common anchors, such as language. And in some ways, many of us would be tempted to describe symbolic efficiency, right, as successful communication, except for one thing. Žižek argues that in our time, symbolic efficiency also refers to an assumed authority, a deference or humility to something larger and more powerful than ourselves, traditionally deity, but more commonly the rule of law, society as such, the people, and so on. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this sense of a larger outside authority is first experienced in childhood as the disciplining parent. And of course, the third thing is a refiguring of Freud's famous Oedipal triangle, which y'all know has been heavily critiqued because of assumptions that we consider sexist today. It also has been critiqued for imposing a kind of familial triangulation against the social and harmfully totalizing or prescriptive ways, as Deleuze and Guattari have argued. A lot of criticism today, however, takes aim at Freud's presumed individualism, which would suggest his insights only pertain to the clinic and cannot be extrapolated for the diagnosis of social or public problems. And this is the problem that Lacan helps us to tackle. He argued we should regard the Oedipal model figuratively, that each figure in the model is often culturally gendered, but that has nothing to do with the individual or biological sex. Rather, one must rethink the triangle in terms of a primary parent and a secondary parent, each of which has maternal and paternal functions, respectively. So with Lacan, we get something like this. Now, unavoidably, the formal structure relies on a mythic childhood to help explain it, but functionally, Lacan suggests the model describes a dynamic process that we are constantly negotiating throughout our lives as a disposition that we habitually take toward others. Here I have an admittedly crude sketch of why Lacan has become so appealing to humanists. The second parent, right, or the paternal function, is equivocated with the symbolic writ large, which is to say, the structuring of culture itself. So the second parent, in other words, is a figural vehicle for a subject's entry into the world of language and meaning. The implication here is that even the family form is determined by the symbolic. It's not the cause. Now, becoming a subject of the family format in this way entails two sorts of moves. First, there is an alienation from the primary parent, and this usually is a typical primary dyad of child mother, but it can be it can be anyone that's sort of functioning as that maternal figure. Then there is a separation from this primary parent with the introduction of the second parent, or parent number two, right, who comes in and says, now you have to share parent one, right? So after the second parent sort of intervenes in the dyad and triangulates it, it becomes possible then for the subject to substitute other love objects, so a sister, a brother, a family dog, right, and so on, since, right, there's now two parents, and so now there can be multiple objects of love. Now, I recognize this is abstract stuff, but here's why I kind of dragged you through it. Becoming a self-conscious person in the social world, a reckoning with thirdness, requires playing. The Oedipal triangle is just one way of conceptualizing the important formative functions of play and its relationship to the art of substitution, which we call creativity. Before a young person can successfully become alienated from the primary parent and then separated as a self-conscious person, she has to negotiate how this is done by playing with various objects that stand in for the primary parent. Here is where Winnicott's theory of play provides brilliant insights. Before a child successfully detaches from the primary parent, various objects are played with to ease this transition in a kind of liminal, or what he calls holding space. These objects represent, in some sense, a kind of primary security. And Winnicott calls these objects, simply enough, transitional objects. Now, Winnicott argues that these transitional objects are also subject to aggression, that children will first try to consume them until they learn that, despite those efforts, the object can't be eaten or destroyed. This first informative form of play, he says, is an imaginative zone for creativity, a what-if space, an as-if space in which rules and social codes are negotiated. For Winnicott, successful playing teaches us that objects have an independence of their own, a kind of vitality that eventually gets afforded to other people, a kind of concern or caring for others, not as objects, but subjects in themselves. Now, at this juncture, one can probably sense how Winnicott's understanding of playing anticipates the dirty play of my opening examples. As I'll soon suggest, pathological play represents a reduction of others to objects and the evaporation of goodwill. If playing represents the fundamental creative means of making and maintaining relationships with others, then the dirty sexter or sneaky lawyer or social media troll are having a kind of object trouble. And they're certainly not playing by the same rules as everyone else. So how then do we describe the rules everyone else in culture is playing that both confine and condone behavior? The answer, of course, is the symbolic efficiency of the third thing, right? This assumed authority. So you see, for many psychoanalytic perspectives, the norm is actually neurosis. That is to say, most of us in this room are neurotic. Me? Which means that we have accepted the no of the second parent and learned to substitute for the primary parent. Lacan suggests that the biggest substitution, of course, is language itself, or as I like to joke, rhetoric is a substitution for your mother. Socially sanctioned play, which is most familiar to us as sex, Sporting, gaming, and entertainment operates on the basis of mutually shared rules and often various implied social contracts. Such a view of neurotic or normal playfulness is consistent with research on play across a broad spectrum of humanistic and scientific perspectives. Regardless of how one leans theoretically, there is a widespread consensus that play is central to the brain, the body, and overall social being of many animals, not just humans. When our field first identified itself as speech, assumptions about play and childhood development were important for those who studied stuttering and the speech sciences. Play has been most usefully theorized by scholars and practitioners of performance studies for whom play plays a significant role in the classroom, on the stage, and across the page. Most of the play research in the social sciences takes aim, anyone want to guess? Takes aim at video games. And much of this is constrained by widely known media effects scholarship that can discern a connection to aggression, but no direct relationship, no causal relationship between violent media and social violence. The critical and social scientific work on play and communication does, however, track a perception and a shift in certain modes of play, the most conspicuous of which are aggressive and mean. Arguably, my opening examples bespeak a kind of dirty gaming. The sexter, the lawyer, and the troll seem to understand cultural norms and expectations, but violate them anyway, as if to say, I'm going to issue racist and sexist attacks because I can. In these examples, paternal and symbolic authority is denied, suggesting a perverse form of cultural play is afoot. And this is where I suggest that Lacan's ideas about psychical structures are useful. Playing dirty is demonstrative of a decline or erosion in symbolic efficiency that Lacan terms the perverse structure. Here is a vocabulary for describing when play goes wrong. The pervert is the person who hears the no of the paternal parent but refuses to give the maternal up, as if to say, I hear you, Pops, but Mom's still mine. The motto of the pervert is, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I'm doing it anyway. The pervert is alienated because they hear the no, they just don't separate. Now, whether or not you think Lacan's refiguring of the Oedipal triangle works for you, I hope this definition of structural perversion nevertheless makes some sense. I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I'm doing it anyway. Most of us neurotics feel guilt. We recognize the limitations of our abilities, and we use play as a creative way to negotiate limitation. On the other hand, the pervert understands the rules, but thinks they're only for suckers and losers. This, in part, is because the pervert believes him or herself, typically himself, he believes he is the enforcer of the rules. Now, the signature of the pervert is the communicative strategy of disavowal, a gesture that affirms a rule or truth at the same moment it is denied. We've already heard disavowal in my opening examples, particularly with the statement, of course, the truth isn't truth. The problem is that disavowal actually represents a perversion of play, a fundamental lack of creativity. Bad play is almost always scripted and rigidly rule-bound. In fact, it's often by the book. It's only a book that many of us like to pretend doesn't exist. And I'm going to explain. But first, I recognize that much of what I said is abstract, and it would be helpful to concretize the theory somewhat. So far I've suggested that cultural norms are shifting from a default of normalized neurotic structure toward perversion, which is a disposition or strategy of relating to others that acknowledges consensus reality at the same moment of its denial. This duplicity is a defense mechanism termed disavowal. I'm also arguing that foul play is a form of disavowal as well. Now, before I move on, I do need to make a caveat here that I am not critiquing perversion as such, only the kind of perverse games that intentionally harm others. Perversion as such is not a bad thing. This is because humans are fundamentally aberrations of reproductive norms. Freud believed that perversion was a universal and common trait. In fact, he argued every one of us is functionally perverse, and insofar as we enjoy food for reasons other than nutritional value, or insofar as we enjoy sex for reasons other than reproduction, we are all deviants from the dictates of a lingering religious dogma of the natural order. From a classically psychoanalytic vantage, perversion is actually the default. Freud said we all come into the world polymorphously perverse. So to hear it from Sigmund, it appears that it is actually heterosexuality that is a perversion of the default of perversion, which is to say the human default is basically queer. So I don't mean to criticize perversion per se. Look, I adore straight people. Some of my best friends are heteros. And besides, perversion is often just another word for fun, which, as you know, girls just want to have. Behavioral or common perversion only becomes pathological when others are forced to play without consent. Indeed, for medical, legal, and moral communities, mutual informed consent is the decision rule between a common perversion and the pathological extreme. So what I'm after here is what Lacan described as a perverse structure, a disposition of character that repeats certain relational patterns that many of us would describe as transgressions. But strictly speaking, structural perversion is not transgressive at all, but rather it is a compulsive repetition of defenses. What appears as playfulness is actually a form of disavowal or dirty work, an acknowledgement of consensus reality and a denial of it at the same time. For example, take Wilmington, North Carolina in 2016. Of course, I need not let Trump's presidency go without mention, because I have been arguing for some time that his rhetoric is structurally perverse. These shots from the stump are particularly demonstrative of playing dirty. What makes disavow a perverse rhetorical strategy, however, is the relationship implied by his turn of speech here, I don't know, the little coda he adds at the end. The speaker, therefore, is above or beyond the symbolic order he denies. He takes no responsibility for it. Now, Trump's obvious example of political obscenity leads, finally, back to guns. To illustrate with an example closer to home, I want to take you back with me to Texas. Now, although mass shootings seem to be increasing, their frequency is not. They're just getting deadlier. Despite popular rhetoric concerning an epidemic of what Professor Brad Serber argues we should term targeted violence, such perceptions are largely the consequence of media overexposure and a firmly entrenched genre of what I would term active shooter television. That I underscore that this Nightline segment foregrounds recordings of calls to emergency personnel, the slow zoom of images of weeping families, and an ominous interweaving drone underneath, all of which have become ubiquitous generic features that deliberately double as traumatic stressors for viewers. There's also mounting evidence suggesting that the media coverage and framing of targeted violence encourages imitation and fame-seeking. Moreover, teleplaying with affect attempts to collapse a sense of spatial and temporal distance and delay, exacerbating a sensibility of crisis that seems almost phatic and addictive in character. This is to say, the now ossified genre of active shooter television is itself now a popular breaking news fixation. As a form of repetition compulsion, we should not be surprised that fixation and addiction is often linked to disavow. These are both compulsive, and they are both defensive. Now, if our attention to media coverage of targeted violence is addictive, we need to also say in the same breath that many claim the same about gun ownership too. These addictions are intimately related. They are two sides of the same projection. Popular discussions of gun violence frequently rehearse the adage that America is addicted to guns, with 3 in 10 American adults claiming to own a gun and another 11% living with someone who does. This so-called addiction is reflected in high gun homicide rates. In the U.S., gun deaths are 25.2 times higher than other high-income countries. The only places worse are in Central and South America, one of the primary reasons behind the caravan. Although media overexposure has helped to raise awareness and set agendas, public discussion tends to focus on issues of or mental health, right, and common sense, so-called common sense gun control, routinely missing the opportunity, like a broken record, to understand targeted violence as a systemic reaction. Owing to a U.S. tendency to resign the responsibility of violence to individuals, we appear to have locked ourselves into the erroneous assumption that prevention requires prediction. Of course, many preventative measures have been taken, and this is good, but my point is that our individualistic ideology leads to failures like profiling. We know, for example, that weapons and whiteness are directly linked, but to the person profiling doesn't help. Shooters tend to be white, male, and prone to aggression. However, this is an impressionist portrait of a rather large pond. There are simply no reliable predictors of mass shootings. Well, none at least narrowly focused on individual actors. Our public addiction to reruns of real-time catastrophe and individual responsibility, this cycle of control freakism from left to right, might be better dubbed a structural violence, which Johann Galtung described as an avoidable, non-personal violence experienced as a social injustice, but obscured or hidden in cultural fantasies of the American spirit. Analyst Glenn Slater elaborates, quote, "When you look hard enough, you come to see that the ethos of the American dream has a built-in but well-camouflaged structural violence, a series of dynamics that promote opportunity but create disenfranchisement. The observation resonates with Robert Merton's argument almost 60 years ago that U.S. culture stresses financial success without structural opportunity, leading to massive strains and the relief valve of criminal innovations and quick fixes." What better represents the quick fix than a gun? A symbol of power and control, an object that functions as a route to mastery, much like a transitional object, except the object isn't transitional, it's stuck. The gun is jammed in culture and cannot be substituted. The Swiss are armed to the teeth, reports Helena Bachmann, but targeted violence there is rare, a point that the NRA likes to amplify. But in the United States, and in no small part because of the NRA, the gun persists as a constant object, something that rhetoricians term synecdoche, but which we might more generally describe as a fetish. Of course, I hardly need to detail the fetishism of the gun. John Lennon did that back in 1968 on the White Album. What I do want to stress here is the way in which the gun has become an object of play, a synecdoche celebrated first in childhood as a toy and later on screens as a great equalizer of power. Rhetorically speaking, the gun is a part that stands in for whole fantasies of Western expansionism and self-made men of action. Consequently, gunplay is shorthand for a ubiquitous fantasy of leveling the playing field. Notably, gunplay is tied as much to the camera as it is to the bullet. There is the fame-seeking component I've already mentioned, which consists of circulation in multiple media, an aspect of targeted violence as a route to celebrity. And if you've gone viral, right, you've made it in America. But there is epistemic symmetry There's epistemic symmetry to gunplay and mass media. Both are a kind of shooting that depend on what the late Paul Virilio described as a logic of disappearance. A logic of disappearance is another way of describing motion and action. Unless something disappears from the frame, unless something disappears from the scope, nothing happens, nothing moves. There is no action. Reflection and thinking are perhaps better reserved for stilettos and still photography, which is a curious way to say the disappearance is the peekaboo of gunplay, an addiction to action. Shoot first, think later. Consider, for example, my state governor shooting off his mouth at a press conference shortly after the massacre at the Santa Fe High School. Is the violence of or at this scene reducible to one troubled teen when those who are most responsible for framing it evoke the fantasy of masculine resolve? That the trench coat wearing shooter and others partake in the same Columbine script should be obvious. Cowards don't shoot straight, they miss. Again, I repeat that playing dirty is not creative. It is a prefab game, and the rules must be ruthlessly enforced. Governor Abbott played along, as did Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who revived the national discussion of arming teachers. This is a rather uncreative solution that mistakes prevention with prediction, not based on research, but Hollywood westerns. And this point brings me back to electoral politics, the exigency with which I began, but now in a slightly different light. Many of us who study politics have been asking ourselves, in the wake of the 2016 election, how did Trump secure the presidency despite all the predictors and polling and conventional logic? One answer, of course, is that Trump put conventions, which is to say both politics as usual and the RNC rally at Nuremberg, on amphetamines. But another is an electoral response to an ideological promise that dismantles the structural means to achieve that very promise. As many of you know, countless public figures, from Susan B. Anthony to Malcolm X to the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, have publicly decried this disjunction, each in their own way pointing out the perversion of trying to dream American, each in their own way pointing out how the restful dream for a few is a nightmare for everyone else. Some have suggested that the sentiment that people of color are prevented from dreaming was quelled during the Obama presidency, perpetuating what Jordan Peele terms the post-racial lie. Some have argued that the unprecedented number of women running for office this year marks ours as the year of the women. And yet we keep hearing echoes of Me Too everywhere at an increasing volume. Regardless of your politics, the most recent national elections reflect a resurgent racism and misogyny, a kind of perverse and criminal innovation or demand to blow it all up. And not just figuratively, but literally. This call for an explosion is not a revolution, it's an amplification of what we've had and what we've got. In what sense has voting been reduced to a quick fix? Is voting the outcome of a considered and reflective process? Is pulling the lever for Clinton or Trump or anyone akin to the control freakism of shooting? It could be that electoral politics is no longer a liminal space of transition and play, a moment of pure contingency, an as if, what if, but rather a cruel game. It could be that voting obscures the violent structure underwriting it, that the Electoral College and voting suppression, both vestiges of anti-suffrage and slavery, give lie to the pipe dream of liberty for all. Many have said that playing politics is war by other means, insofar as elections can result in the dismantling of welfare writ large, such as ending human services, or of separating families at the border, or of describing anyone of color as a criminal or an animal, or refusing to provide aid to a devastated Puerto Rico, or supporting dictators and fascists who killed reporters, or goading anti-Semitic shooting sprees, or making fun of women who were sexually assaulted, or repealing health care for those who need it, or inspiring and goading the rise of nationalism and Nazism, or in responding to mass shootings by saying we need more guns, including armed teachers. In what sense can we say electoral politics has become mass shooting by other means? Now I get to go eat.
All that I had hoped for and more. Sometimes I am speechless, not often, but this was really powerful and meaningful in our contemporary situation. So I just want to express appreciation. A little gift bag for you.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
Appreciate it.